In 1887, Cedar Ridge, Martha Whitfield stood abandoned at the altar for the third time, watching her groom flee rather than marry a woman society deemed unworthy. But sometimes the most broken hearts find the strongest love in the most unexpected places. Welcome to a story that will challenge everything you think you know about love, worth, and second chances. This is the tale of Martha Whitfield, a woman who society cast aside until one mountain man saw what everyone else missed. Stay with me until the very end, and don't forget to comment below with your city so I can see how far this incredible story travels across the world. The autumn wind howled through Cedar Ridge like a wounded animal, carrying with it the whispers that had haunted Martha Whitfield for 28 long years. She pressed her substantial frame against the window of Henderson's general store, watching the townspeople hurry past, with their heads bent against the cold, their voices lost in the storm that was brewing both outside and within her own heart. 3 times, she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the glass. 3 times they've run. Behind her, the familiar creak of floorboards announced Mrs. Henderson's approach. The older woman's footsteps were careful, measured the same way everyone in Cedar Ridge moved around Martha these days, as if her very presence might somehow contaminate their perfect little lives. "Martha, dear," Mrs. Henderson's voice carried that particular tone of forced sympathy that had become as familiar as breathing. "Perhaps you should head home early today. The storm's getting worse and Swim, she trailed off, but Martha knew what she meant. And we wouldn't want you catching pneumonia and becoming even more of a burden." Martha turned slowly, her brown eyes meeting Mrs. Henderson's pale blue ones. At nearly 6 feet tall and weighing close to 300 pounds, Martha had learned long ago that her very existence made people uncomfortable. Not because she was unkind, indeed, she was known throughout Cedar Ridge for her gentle nature and quick wit. No, it was because she dared to take up space in a world that had decided women like her simply shouldn't exist. "I'll finish the inventory first," Martha replied quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. "The Jameson order needs to be ready for pickup tomorrow." Mrs. Henderson's mouth tightened into that familiar line of disapproval, but she nodded curtly and retreated to the back of the store. Martha had been working at Henderson's general store for nearly 10 years, ever since her father's death had left her with little choice but to earn her own keep. She was good at her job, meticulous, honest, and possessed of a head for numbers that even impressed the town's banker. But none of that seemed to matter when it came to the one thing every woman in Cedar Ridge was expected to achieve: marriage. The bell above the door chimed, and Martha looked up to see Sarah Jameson entering with her usual flutter of silk skirts and carefully arranged blonde curls. Sarah was everything Martha was not: petite, delicate, and married to one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. She was also one of the few people in town who still spoke to Martha with something approaching genuine kindness. "Martha," Sarah's voice carried its usual warmth, though Martha couldn't miss the way her friend's eyes immediately swept over her appearance with that mix of concern and pity that had become so familiar. "How are you holding up, dear?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about what had happened at the harvest dance just 3 days prior. How Martha had finally accepted young Thomas Brennan's invitation, how she'd spent her last savings on fabric for a new dress, how she'd arrived at the town hall with hope burning bright in her chest, only to watch Thomas take one look at her and immediately ask Lucy Patterson to dance instead. "I'm well enough," Martha replied, her fingers tightening around the pencil she'd been using for the inventory. "Just keeping busy." Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice to that conspiratorial whisper that women used when they wanted to share secrets. "Martha, you know I care about you like a sister. Have you thought about perhaps visiting my cousin in San Francisco? She runs a boarding house there, and I'm sure she could use someone with your organizational skills. Sometimes a fresh start is what everyone thinks I need." Martha finished, her voice sharper than she'd intended. She immediately regretted the tone. Sarah meant well. They all did in their own way. But good intentions felt like thorns when they came wrapped in the assumption that she needed to disappear in order to find happiness. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. "I only meant, I know what you meant." Martha's voice softened. "And I appreciate the concern truly, but I was born in Cedar Ridge, same as you. My parents are buried in the cemetery on the hill. This is my home, regardless of what anyone else might think about my situation." The word situation hung between them like a curse. Martha's situation, her weight, her 3 failed engagements, her stubborn refusal to accept that perhaps she was simply meant to live life as a spinster, grateful for whatever scraps of kindness the world saw fit to throw her way. The door chimed again, and this time it brought with it a gust of wind so fierce it nearly knocked over the display of canned goods near the entrance. But it wasn't the weather that made Martha's stomach clench. It was the sight of Thomas Brennan himself, shaking raindrops from his hat and looking anywhere but directly at her. Sarah stiffened beside her, and Martha could practically feel the awkwardness it radiating from her friend's petite frame. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, avoiding someone indefinitely was simply impossible, but that didn't make these encounters any less painful. "Afternoon, ladies." Thomas mumbled, his eyes fixed firmly on the display of fishing supplies in the far corner. "Just need to pick up some tobacco for my father." Martha watched him for a moment, studying the young man who had once whispered sweet words about her intelligence and kind heart. Thomas was handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way that mothers approved of: blonde hair, neatly combed broad shoulders from years of ranch work, and blue eyes that had once looked at her with something that might have been genuine affection. Until the moment he'd actually seen her in public, until he'd been forced to choose between his private feelings and public reputation. "The tobacco's behind the counter," Martha said quietly, moving toward the register with as much dignity as she could muster. "Will that be the regular blend?" Thomas finally looked at her then, and Martha saw something flicker across his features. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. But whatever emotion it wasn't strong enough to override the shame that colored his cheeks red. "Yes, ma'am," he replied formally, as if she were a stranger rather than the woman he'd once promised to marry. "Thank you." The transaction was completed in silence, with Sarah hovering nearby like a protective hen and Thomas fumbling with his coins as if he'd never handled money before. When he finally left, the bell's cheerful chime seemed to mock the tension that lingered in the air. "Martha," Sarah began, but Martha held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," she said quietly. "Please, whatever you're going to say, I've already heard it. From you, from Mrs. Henderson, from every well-meaning person in this town who thinks they understand what it's like to be me." Sarah's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. Finally, she managed, "I just want you to be happy." "Happy?" Martha tasted the word like it was something foreign. "Do you know what would make me happy, Sarah, being seen? Not as a problem to be solved or a charity case to be pitied, but as a woman with the same hopes and dreams as anyone else." "But surely you understand that people judge." "Yes, I understand that perfectly." Martha's voice grew stronger, fed by years of swallowed anger and carefully contained hurt. "What I don't understand is why their judgment matters more than my humanity." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, in a way that made Sarah take a step backward. It was one thing to pity poor Martha Whitfield. It was quite another to be confronted with the reality of her pain. "I should go," Sarah said, finally gathering her skirts around her like armor. "James will be expecting his supper." And then she was gone, leaving Martha alone with the inventory sheets and the weight of her own honesty. Outside, the storm was growing stronger, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the wooden sidewalks like lost souls searching for shelter. Martha returned to her work, but the numbers on the page seemed to blur together as her mind wandered to the conversation that had just taken place. How many times had she heard variations of the same theme? Perhaps if you tried harder with your appearance, Martha. Perhaps if you were more accommodating, more grateful for any attention at all. Perhaps if you simply accepted that your expectations were too high. Perhaps. Always the burden was placed on her to change, to shrink, to apologize for taking up space in a world that had already decided she didn't belong. The afternoon passed slowly, with few customers brave enough to venture out in the increasingly violent weather. Mrs. Henderson had retreated to her quarters above the store, leaving Martha alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that something had to change. Not her body, she'd tried that path before, starving herself until she fainted during church services, only to gain back every lost pound and more when her body rebelled against the deprivation. Not her personality, she refused to make herself smaller in spirit just because the world demanded it of her physically. No, what needed to change was her situation. Her dependence on the charity and goodwill of people who saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. As she was locking up the cash register, Martha's fingers brushed against the letter that had arrived that morning, the one from her late aunt's lawyer in Denver. She'd been too busy to read it properly, but now, in the growing darkness of the storm, she pulled it out and unfolded the cream-colored paper. Dear Miss Whitfield, I am writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary of your Aunt Beatrice Whitfield's estate. The property in question consists of a 640-acre ranch located approximately 20 miles north of Cedar Ridge, along with all buildings, livestock, and mineral rights therein. The estimated value of the estate is $15,000. However, there is one condition attached to this inheritance as stipulated in your aunt's will. You must be legally married within 1 year of this date, or the property will revert to the territorial government for public auction. Your aunt believed strongly in the importance of marriage and family, and wished to ensure that her legacy would continue through proper channels. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer of property and the legal requirements involved. Respectfully yours, Theodore Harrison Esquire. Martha read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. $15,000, 640 acres. Her own land, her own home, her own chance at independence if she could find a husband within 12 months. The irony was so sharp it nearly made her laugh out loud. Here she was, a woman who couldn't convince a single man in Cedar Ridge to marry her, suddenly faced with the prospect of needing to find a husband in order to claim the one thing that could set her free from needing anyone at all. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the store in stark black and white, and for a moment Martha felt as if she were seeing her life with the same clarity. She could stay in Cedar Ridge, continue working at the general store, continue enduring the pitying looks and well-meaning advice, continue waiting for some miracle that would make her acceptable in the eyes of society. Or she could take the risk, claim her inheritance, and forge a new path entirely. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Martha carefully folded the letter and slipped it into her coat pocket. Then she gathered her things, extinguished the lamps, and stepped out into the storm. The wind immediately tried to tear her hat from her head, and the rain soaked through her wool coat within seconds, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning and calculating and daring to hope. She had savings, not much, but enough to travel to Denver and meet with the lawyer. She had skills that would translate to ranch management. Her years at the general store had taught her about inventory finances and dealing with difficult customers. What she didn't have was a husband, but perhaps that was a problem that could be solved with honesty rather than romance. The walk home to her small rented room behind the bakery had never seemed so long, but it gave her time to think. By the time she reached her door, Martha had made a decision that would have shocked every person in Cedar Ridge. She was going to claim her inheritance with or without a husband. And if that meant finding someone willing to enter into a marriage of convenience, so be it. She was done apologizing for her existence, done accepting that her worth was determined by other people's comfort levels, done believing that love was something she didn't deserve simply because she didn't fit into the narrow confines of what society deemed acceptable. As she lit the lamp in her small room and began composing a letter to the lawyer in Denver, Martha Whitfield felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a woman trying to change herself to fit someone else's expectations, but the steady, determined hope of someone who had finally decided to bet on herself. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside her tiny room, Martha was already planning for calmer weather. She had 11 months and 3 weeks to find a solution to her marriage requirement, and for the first time in her life, she felt equal to the challenge. What she couldn't have known as she wrote by lamplight, while the wind howled through the gaps in her windows, was that her solution would come from the most unexpected source of all: a man who lived beyond the edges of civilization, who understood what it meant to be judged and found wanting, and who would see in her exactly what she had been waiting her whole life for someone to recognize. But that meeting was still weeks away, waiting for her in the mountains where the storm was fiercest, and the night was darkest, where sometimes the most broken souls find exactly what they need to become whole again. For now, though, Martha simply wrote her letter and allowed herself to dream of a future where she would never again have to explain her right to exist, to love, or to take up space in the world. It was a dream worth fighting for, and fight for it she would with every ounce of strength and determination in her considerable heart. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, but Martha Whitfield had weathered worse tempests than this, and she was just getting started. 3 weeks later, Martha found herself standing at the edge of civilization, quite literally. The stagecoach that had brought her from Denver disappeared into a cloud of dust and regret, leaving her alone on what the driver had optimistically called a road, but which looked more like a deer path carved into the mountainside by someone with a questionable understanding of geography. The lawyer's office in Denver had been everything she'd expected: mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and the kind of respectful efficiency that money could buy. Theodore Harrison had been thorough in explaining the inheritance, sympathetic about the marriage requirement, and utterly unhelpful when it came to suggesting how she might actually fulfill her aunt's bizarre condition. "Perhaps you might consider advertising in the territorial papers," he'd suggested delicately, his fingers steepled over the contract. "There are men seeking wives throughout the territory. Practical arrangements, you understand." Martha had understood perfectly. Men seeking wives usually meant men seeking housekeepers, cooks, and companions who came with legal documentation. It wasn't romance they were advertising for, it was convenience. The thought should have depressed her, but instead it had sparked an idea. If marriage was to be a business arrangement, then perhaps she should approach it like any other business transaction. She had assets now: land, money, independence. She had skills and intelligence. What she needed was a partner, not a romantic hero from one of those dime novels that Sarah Jameson was always reading. The ranch itself sat in a valley 23 miles north of Cedar Ridge, accessible only by a narrow mountain trail that wound through pine forests and granite outcroppings like a snake with a grudge against straight lines. Martha had insisted on seeing the property before making any decisions about her future, despite the lawyer's obvious reluctance to send a woman alone into what he called challenging terrain. Now standing with her 2 carpetbags and a leather satchel containing every important document she owned, Martha was beginning to understand his concern. The October afternoon was crisp enough to make her breath visible, and the pine-scented air carried an edge that spoke of winter's approach. More concerning was the fact that the trail ahead disappeared around a bend that looked steep enough to challenge a mountain goat. But Martha had not come this far to be deterred by inconvenient geography. She hefted her bag, squared her shoulders, and began walking. The first mile was deceptively easy, following what had once been a proper wagon road before weather and neglect had reduced it to its current questionable state. Martha's sturdy boots found purchase on the rocky ground, and despite her size, years of hard work had given her a strength that served her well as the path began to climb. It was during the second mile that the weather began to change. What had started as a few innocent clouds gathering around the mountain peaks quickly developed into something more ominous. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of the kind of mountain storm that could turn a simple journey into a life-threatening ordeal. Martha paused to catch her breath and reassess her situation. Behind her, the trail descended toward civilization and safety. Ahead, it climbed steadily toward a destination she couldn't see and might not reach before the storm hit in earnest. The sensible thing would be to turn back, spend the night in the last town she'd passed through, and attempt the journey again when the weather cleared. But sensible had never gotten Martha Whitfield anything except a lifetime of disappointment and other people's low expectations. "Aunt Beatrice," she said aloud, her voice carrying on the wind, "you always were the stubborn one in the family. I suppose I come by it honestly." She resumed walking, but the storm had other plans. Within an hour, what had been threatening clouds became a reality of swirling snow and wind that cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper. The trail, never clearly marked to begin with, became nearly impossible to follow as snow began to accumulate on the ground. Martha pressed on, driven by a stubbornness that bordered on foolishness and a determination that refused to acknowledge the increasingly dire nature of her situation. She had left Cedar Ridge with purpose, claimed her inheritance with pride, and she would be damned if she was going to let a little weather prevent her from seeing what was rightfully hers. The little weather had other ideas. By the time Martha admitted to herself that she was in serious trouble, the snow was falling so heavily that she could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The trail had vanished entirely, lost under a blanket of white that made every direction look the same. Her feet were numb despite her boots, her hands ached even inside her gloves, and her breath came in painful gasps that spoke of exhaustion and altitude. Worse yet, she was no longer entirely certain which direction led back toward civilization and which led deeper into the wilderness. The storm had disoriented her completely, turning the landscape into a maze of white shapes that could have been rocks, trees, or open air. "This is not how I planned to die," Martha muttered through chattering teeth, setting down her bags and trying to think through her limited options. She could continue walking and hope to stumble across shelter or the trail. She could stay where she was and hope the storm passed quickly, or she could admit that her pride had finally gotten her into a situation that her determination couldn't solve. That was when she heard a sound that didn't belong to wind or weather. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and getting closer. Footsteps, heavy ones crunching through the snow with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. "Hello," Martha called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was only the howling of the storm and the hammering of her own heart. Then a voice answered, deep, cautious, and surprisingly close. "Ma'am, what in God's name are you doing out here?" A figure emerged from the swirling snow like something from a fairy tale, and Martha's first thought was that her eyes must be playing tricks on her. The man who approached was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall and broad in proportion, with dark hair and a beard that had clearly never seen the inside of a barber shop. He was dressed in buckskins and furs, carried what looked like a hunting rifle, and moved through the storm as if it were merely a minor inconvenience. "I'm looking for the Whitfield ranch," Martha managed through numb lips. "I'm Martha Whitfield. It's my property now." The giant stopped about 6 feet away, close enough that she could see his eyes, brown, intelligent, and currently studying her with an expression that mixed concern with disbelief. "The old Beatrice place." His voice carried a slight accent that Martha couldn't quite identify. "Ma'am, that's still 3 miles up the mountain, and this storm's getting worse by the minute. You'll freeze to death before you make it halfway." "Then I suppose I'd better get moving," Martha replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She reached for her bags, but the movement sent a wave of dizziness through her that nearly brought her to her knees. The man was beside her in an instant, one massive hand steadying her arm, while the other took the bags from her nerveless fingers. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're in no condition to go anywhere right now. My cabin's less than a mile from here down in the valley. You can warm up, wait out the storm, and I'll guide you to your place when the weather clears." Martha wanted to refuse accepting help from a strange man in the wilderness, went against every rule of proper behavior she'd ever been taught. But her body was betraying her, shivering so violently that she could barely stand, and the alternative to accepting his help appeared to be dying, with her dignity intact but her body frozen solid. "I don't even know your name," she said weakly. "Ezra Stone," he replied, already shouldering her bags along with his rifle. "And right now, ma'am, names are less important than getting you somewhere warm before you become a casualty of your own determination." Without waiting for her permission, he placed one arm around her waist and began guiding her through the storm. Martha was too cold and too grateful to protest the impropriety of being touched by a stranger, especially when his support was the only thing keeping her upright. The journey to his cabin passed in a blur of white and wind, with Ezra Stone moving through the storm as if he had some internal compass that guided him unerringly toward shelter. Martha focused on putting one foot in front of the other and trying not to collapse entirely, which was becoming increasingly difficult as exhaustion and cold took their toll. When the cabin finally appeared through the snow, Martha's first thought was that it looked like something from a children's story, low and sturdy, built of logs and river stone, with smoke rising from a chimney that promised warmth and safety. Her second thought was that she was about to faint. "Easy there." Ezra's voice seemed to come from very far away as her knees buckled. "Almost there." The next few minutes passed in a haze of sensations. The blessed warmth of the cabin's interior, the crackling of a fire, the feeling of being lowered onto something soft and warm. Martha drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of boots being removed from her feet, of blankets being tucked around her shoulders, of a cup being pressed to her lips, containing something hot and slightly bitter. When she finally came fully back to herself, she was lying on a narrow bed near the fireplace, wrapped in what felt like half a dozen quilts, and gradually returning to something resembling normal body temperature. The cabin around her was small but well appointed, with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and shelves lined with books that suggested its owner was more educated than his appearance might indicate. Ezra Stone himself sat in a chair near the fire, no longer wearing his furs, and looking somewhat less intimidating in a simple wool shirt and dark trousers. He was whittling something from a piece of pine, his movements careful and precise, but his attention was clearly focused on his unexpected guest. "Feeling better?" he asked when he noticed her watching him. "Much thank you." Martha struggled to sit up, suddenly aware that accepting hospitality was one thing, but lying in a strange man's bed was quite another. You should rest," Ezra interrupted firmly. "The storm's still raging out there, and you were closer to serious trouble than you probably realize. Hypothermia's nothing to fool with." Martha settled back against the pillows, partly because he was right, and partly because she didn't seem to have much choice in the matter. Her body felt heavy and uncooperative, as if the warmth was making her realize just how exhausted she really was. "I suppose I should thank you," she said quietly. "You probably saved my life." Ezra shrugged, his attention returning to his whittling. "Anyone would have done the same." "Would they?" Martha studied his profile, noting the strong jaw and the way his hair fell across his forehead. "In my experience, people tend to help when it's convenient and look the other way when it's not." Something in her tone made him glance up, and for a moment their eyes met across the small space of the cabin. Martha saw something there, a recognition perhaps, or an understanding that went deeper than their brief acquaintance should have allowed. "Maybe you've been around the wrong kind of people," Ezra said finally. "Maybe I have." Martha pulled the quilts more tightly around herself, not because she was cold, but because the conversation was straying into territory that felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with mountain storms. You live here alone for the past 5 years. Ezra's knife paused in its work. It suits me. It's very peaceful, Martha offered, though the word seemed inadequate for the profound sense of isolation that the cabin represented. Don't you get lonely? The question seemed to surprise him, as if loneliness was not something he'd considered or chosen to acknowledge. Sometimes, he admitted after a long pause, but lonely's better than some alternatives. There was a story there, Martha realized, pain carefully contained behind a wall of solitude and self-sufficiency. She recognized it because she'd built similar walls herself, though hers were constructed from different materials and served different purposes. I understand, she said simply. Ezra looked at her again, and this time the recognition in his eyes was unmistakable. Do you? More than you might think. Martha shifted against the pillows, trying to find a comfortable position that didn't make her feel quite so much like an invalid. I came out here because I inherited my aunt's ranch, but also because I needed to get away from people who thought they knew what was best for me. And what did they think was best? That I should be grateful for any attention at all, that I should lower my expectations and accept whatever scraps of affection someone might throw my way. The words came out more bitter than she'd intended, but the warmth of the cabin and the strange intimacy of their situation seemed to encourage honesty. That I should disappear somewhere no one would have to look at me and feel uncomfortable. Ezra set down his whittling entirely now, giving her his full attention. And what do you think is best? I think I deserve the same chance at happiness as anyone else. I think my worth isn't determined by whether other people find me acceptable. Martha met his gaze steadily. I think I'd rather live alone and proud than married and ashamed. That's a dangerous philosophy in this territory, Ezra observed. People don't much like independence, especially in women. I'm beginning to understand that independence is something you have to take, not something you wait for people to give you. Martha paused, then added quietly, though I suppose there's a difference between choosing solitude and having it forced on you. Is there? Ezra's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. Sometimes I wonder if the end result isn't the same either way. Maybe, but I think choosing feels different even if the outcome looks identical to outside observers. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. Martha found herself studying her rescuer more carefully now that she was fully conscious and warm. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the image of a mountain hermit, the books on his shelves, the careful way he spoke the cabin itself, which showed signs of education and refinement, despite its rustic appearance. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Depends on the question. What brought you here to this life, I mean? Ezra was quiet for so long that Martha began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the words were rarely shared. I was a soldier, he said simply. During the war, saw things, did things that civilized society doesn't much want to hear about. When I came back, I found I didn't fit anymore. People would shake my hand and thank me for my service, but they'd look at me like I was something dangerous they couldn't quite trust. And so you left. And so I left. He picked up his whittling again, but his movements were mechanical now, as if his hands needed something to do, while his mind wandered through memories. Found this place built, the cabin, learned to live with my own company. It's not the life I planned, but it's honest. Honest, Martha repeated thoughtfully. That's not a word you hear much in polite society. No, it's not. Ezra glanced at her again. What about you? What made you decide to claim your inheritance instead of staying in whatever town you came from? Cedar Ridge. And I suppose I got tired of apologizing for existing. Martha pulled the quilts higher as if they could shield her from the vulnerability of the admission. Tired of pretending that other people's comfort mattered more than my own dignity. That takes courage. Or stupidity. I'm not entirely certain there's a difference sometimes. Ezra smiled at that, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and Martha felt something warm uncurl in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the quilts. Maybe courage and stupidity are just different words for the same thing, he suggested. Depends on whether it works out in the end. And if it doesn't work out, then at least you tried on your own terms instead of someone else's. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the small cabin, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the comfort of being understood without having to explain herself. It was dangerous, this feeling of connection with a man she'd known for less than a day. Dangerous and unexpected, and more precious than all the ranch land in the territory. But as she drifted toward sleep in the warmth of Ezra Stone's cabin, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the crackling of the fire, Martha allowed herself to wonder if perhaps the most important discoveries in life came not from careful planning, but from getting thoroughly lost and finding yourself rescued by exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. The storm would pass and she would continue to her ranch, and life would move forward with all its complications and challenges. But this moment, this unexpected sanctuary in the wilderness, with a man who understood the weight of solitude, would remain with her like a gift she'd never known she needed. Tomorrow would bring new problems and decisions. Tonight she was simply grateful to be alive, warm, and in the company of someone who didn't require her to be anything other than exactly who she was. It was, Martha thought, as sleep finally claimed her, the best she'd felt about herself in longer than she cared to remember. Martha woke to the sound of splitting wood and the aroma of coffee brewing over an open fire. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling of rough-hewn logs, the weight of quilts that smelled of pine and wood smoke, the blessed absence of Mrs. Henderson's disapproving sniffs from the next room. Then it all came flooding back, the storm, the near-death experience on the mountain trail, and Ezra Stone's unexpected rescue. She sat up carefully, pleased to discover that her body had returned to something approaching normal function. Through the single window she could see that the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Everything was white and pristine, as if nature had decided to start fresh with a clean slate. "Good morning." Ezra's voice came from somewhere near the fireplace. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you." Martha swung her legs over the side of the bed, acutely aware that she was still wearing yesterday's travel dress and that her hair had escaped its pins during the night. "I should be getting to the ranch. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "No imposition," Ezra replied, appearing in her line of sight with a tin cup in his hands. "Coffee." Martha accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. The coffee was strong and black, with a bite that cleared the last cobwebs from her mind. "The trail will be treacherous for a few hours yet," Ezra continued, settling into the chair he'd occupied the night before. "Snow's still fresh, and there are places where it could give way without warning. Better to wait until the sun's had a chance to settle things." "You're very kind, but I don't want to—" "Ma'am," Ezra interrupted gently, "yesterday you nearly died because you were too proud to turn back when common sense said you should. Don't make the same mistake twice." The words stung because they were true. Martha sipped her coffee and studied her rescuer's face, looking for signs of judgment or condescension. Instead, she found only practical concern and something that might have been understanding. "You're right," she admitted. "I suppose I'm not very good at accepting help." "Most people worth knowing aren't," Ezra observed. "Independence is hard won and harder to give up even temporarily." They drank their coffee in comfortable silence while the morning light grew stronger outside. Martha found herself stealing glances at her host, noting details she'd missed in the previous night's exhausted haze. His hands were scarred but gentle as he worked to prepare breakfast beans and bacon cooked in a cast-iron skillet that had clearly seen years of use. His movements were economical and sure, speaking of a man who'd learned to take care of himself without complaint or ceremony. "Can I ask you something?" Martha said, finally. "Seems fair, considering you answered my questions last night. Do you ever regret it, choosing this life?" Ezra paused in his cooking, considering the question with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Regret's a complicated word," he said finally. "Do I regret leaving behind a world that had no place for who I'd become? No. Do I sometimes wonder what might have been different if I'd tried harder to fit back in sometimes? And what conclusion do you reach when you wonder that some bridges get burned whether you light the match or not? The question is whether you're going to stand in the ashes feeling sorry for yourself or build something new where you are." Martha nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in his words. It was a philosophy she was still learning to embrace, the idea that moving forward sometimes meant leaving things behind rather than trying endlessly to fix what was irreparably broken. "What about you?" Ezra asked, dividing the breakfast between two plates. "Any regrets about leaving Cedar Ridge?" "Only that I didn't do it sooner," Martha replied without hesitation, "though I suppose I needed to reach the point where staying hurt more than leaving." "And the ranch, what are your plans for it?" Martha accepted the plate he offered, surprised by how hungry she was. The beans were perfectly seasoned, the bacon crisp without being overdone. It was simple food, but prepared with care and attention that spoke of respect for both the ingredients and the person who would eat them. "I'm not entirely certain yet," she admitted between bites. "I know the basics of running a business from my work at the general store, but ranching is different. I'll need to hire help, learn about cattle and horses, figure out how to make the land profitable." "Your aunt ran it alone for 15 years after her husband died," Ezra said. "Of course, she had help from neighboring ranchers when she needed it. Mountain folk tend to look out for each other." "Did you know her well?" "Well enough. She was a formidable woman, reminded me of you, actually. Independent, stubborn, not particularly concerned with what other people thought she should or shouldn't do." Martha felt a flush of warmth at the comparison. She'd heard stories about her father's sister, the woman who'd scandalized the family by refusing to remarry after her husband's death, who'd run a ranch and raised cattle and generally lived life on her own terms until the day she died. "She never mentioned having neighbors," Martha said. "Mountain neighbors are different from town neighbors. We don't drop by for social calls or borrow cups of sugar, but when someone needs help, real help, we show up." "And you think I'll need help?" Ezra met her eyes directly. "Ma'am, running a ranch alone is hard work for anyone. For someone with no experience in country that can kill you if you make the wrong decision, yes, I think you'll need help." It wasn't condescension in his voice, Martha realized, but simple honesty. The kind of straightforward assessment that came from someone who understood the realities of mountain life without the cushioning effect of polite society's euphemisms. "What would you suggest? Learn the land first, walk every acre, understand the water sources, figure out where the best grazing is and where the dangerous spots are. Meet your neighbors, not just the friendly ones, but the ones who might cause problems. And find someone who knows cattle to help you evaluate what your aunt left behind." "Someone like you." The words were out before Martha could stop them, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She'd meant to ask for advice, not proposition the man who'd saved her life. But Ezra didn't seem offended by her directness. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with those intelligent brown eyes. "I know cattle," he said slowly, "and I know this country better than most. But I should warn you, I'm not exactly popular with some of your other neighbors." "Why not?" "Same reason I left civilization in the first place. Some folks think a man who's seen combat is unpredictable, dangerous. They prefer to keep their distance." "And are you dangerous, I mean?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, and Martha had the sense that her question had touched on something important, not just about his reputation, but about how he saw himself. I can be," he said finally, "when I need to be, but I've never hurt anyone who didn't try to hurt me first." "Then it sounds like you're exactly the kind of neighbor I'd want to have," Martha replied firmly. "Someone who understands the difference between being dangerous and being a danger." Something shifted in Ezra's expression, surprise perhaps, or gratitude. It occurred to Martha that it had probably been a long time since anyone had bothered to make that distinction where he was concerned. "I'll think about it," he said. "For now, we should get you to your ranch so you can see what you're dealing with." They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and Martha helped clean the dishes, despite Ezra's protests that she was still his guest. It felt natural working alongside him in the small space of the cabin, as if they'd been sharing domestic routines for years rather than hours. When it came time to leave, Martha found herself oddly reluctant to go. The cabin had become a refuge in more ways than one, not just from the storm, but from the constant pressure to justify her existence that had defined so much of her life in Cedar Ridge. Here, with Ezra, she could simply be herself without explanation or apology. "Thank you," she said, as he shouldered her bags once again, "for everything. I know I would have died out there without your help." "You would have found a way," Ezra replied. "Women like you usually do. Women like me, survivors, fighters, women who don't give up even when common sense says they should." The words warmed Martha more than any compliment about her appearance ever could have. To be seen as strong, as capable, as someone who could weather storms, both literal and metaphorical, it was exactly what she'd been hoping someone would recognize about her someday. The journey to the ranch took less than an hour in clear weather, following a trail that wound through pine forests and across meadows that would undoubtedly be breathtaking in spring. Ezra moved with the same sure-footed confidence he'd shown during the storm, pointing out landmarks and potential hazards, with the casual expertise of someone who knew every rock and tree in the territory. When the ranch buildings finally came into view, Martha felt her breath catch in her throat. The house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story log structure with a wide front porch and windows that faced the morning sun. There were outbuildings clustered around it, a barn, a chicken coop, what looked like a smokehouse, and several smaller structures whose purposes she could only guess at. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Your aunt kept it in good repair," Ezra agreed. "Most of the buildings are sound, and the house has been winterized properly. You won't freeze assuming you can keep the fires going." They approached the house together, and Ezra helped her locate the spare key that the lawyer had mentioned would be hidden under a loose board on the porch. The front door opened with a creak that spoke of recent use, and Martha stepped into her inheritance for the first time. The interior was rustic but comfortable, with furniture that had been built to last, and a fireplace large enough to heat the main room effectively. There were signs everywhere of a woman who'd lived alone by choice rather than circumstance, books on the shelves, half-finished needlework in a basket by the window, a kitchen organized for efficiency rather than entertaining. "She lived well," Martha said softly, running her fingers along the mantelpiece where several photographs were displayed. One showed a younger version of Aunt Beatrice standing beside a tall man with kind eyes, her late husband presumably. Another showed the ranch in its early days, when the buildings were newer and the surrounding trees were smaller. "She was content," Ezra agreed. "That's more than most people manage." They spent the next hour exploring the property, with Ezra pointing out the practical details that would matter in the months ahead. The well was in good condition, the barn was sturdy enough to shelter livestock through the winter, and the fencing was mostly intact, though it would need repairs come spring. It was when they were examining the cattle, a small herd of perhaps 30 head, that had weathered the storm in the shelter of the barn and surrounding outbuildings, that the first sign of trouble appeared. A group of riders was approaching from the south, moving with the kind of purposeful speed that suggested their visit was not entirely social. Ezra tensed beside her, his hand moving unconsciously toward his rifle. "Trouble?" Martha asked. "Maybe. That's Samuel Hutchins and his boys. They own the spread that borders yours to the south." Are they neighbors I should be concerned about? Hutchins has been trying to buy this land for years. Your aunt refused to sell no matter what he offered. He might see your arrival as a new opportunity to negotiate. The riders pulled up in the yard with a flourish of dust and jingling spurs. Samuel Hutchins proved to be a man in his 50s, well-dressed in the manner of someone who wanted to make sure everyone knew he was prosperous. The three men with him were clearly hired hands, hard-faced and alert, in the way of men who were paid to be intimidating. "Well, well," Hutchins called out, his voice carrying the kind of false joviality that immediately put Martha on guard. "You must be Beatrice's niece. Welcome to the territory, Miss." "Mrs. Whitfield," Martha replied firmly, making a split-second decision about how to present herself. If these men were looking for a vulnerable woman to intimidate, she would give them something else to consider. "Mrs. Whitfield, of course." Hutchins dismounted and approached with his hat in his hands, playing the part of the courteous neighbor. "I'm Samuel Hutchins. I own the Broken H Ranch just south of here. This is quite a spread you've inherited." "Thank you. I'm looking forward to making it my home." "About that," Hutchins continued, his smile becoming slightly less genuine. "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I wanted to make you an offer. Ranching is hard work, especially for a woman alone. I'd be willing to take this place off your hands for a fair price, save you the trouble of trying to manage it yourself." "That's very thoughtful," Martha replied carefully, "but I have no intention of selling. This ranch is my inheritance, and I plan to honor my aunt's legacy by maintaining it." Something flickered in Hutchins' eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. "Mrs. Whitfield, I fear you may not understand the challenges you're facing. This is rough country, and ranching requires knowledge and experience that can't be learned overnight. A woman in your situation might find the work overwhelming." The pause before situation was clearly meant to reference her size, her unmarried state, or both. Martha felt her temper stir, but before she could respond, Ezra stepped forward. "The lady seems capable of making her own decisions," he said quietly, but there was steel in him in his voice that made Hutchins' hired hands shift nervously in their saddles. "Stone," Hutchins acknowledged with obvious distaste. "I should have known you'd be involved in this somehow." "I'm not involved in anything except being a good neighbor," Ezra replied. "Same as you, I'm sure." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Martha could sense undercurrents of hostility that went deeper than a simple disagreement about land sales, and she realized she was witnessing the kind of conflict that could define her experience as a rancher. "Mr. Hutchins," she said, stepping slightly forward to make it clear that she was speaking for herself. "I appreciate your concern, but my decision is final. I won't be selling the ranch." "Perhaps you'd like some time to think about it," Hutchins suggested, his voice hardening. "Living alone out here can be dangerous. Accidents happen. Cattle go missing. Sometimes a woman finds that the challenges are more than she bargained for." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This was what Ezra had meant about needing to know which neighbors might cause problems. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hutchins?" she asked, her voice carrying more courage than she felt. "Threatening, good Lord, no. Simply pointing out the realities of ranch life in this territory. But I can see that you're determined to learn those realities for yourself." Hutchins remounted his horse, his false courtesy evaporating entirely. "Good day, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." The group rode off with the same dramatic flair they'd arrived with, leaving Martha and Ezra standing in the yard, watching them disappear into the distance. "Well," Martha said finally, "that was enlightening." "Hutchins is a problem," Ezra said bluntly. "He's been expanding his holdings for years, usually by making life difficult for smaller ranchers until they give up and sell. Your aunt was one of the few who refused to be intimidated. And you think he'll try the same tactics with me? I think he just did. The question is how far he's willing to go if you continue to refuse." Martha considered this, weighing her options with the same careful thought she'd once applied to inventory management at the general store. The difference was that this time the stakes were considerably higher than a few dollars in profit or loss. "Then I suppose I'd better be prepared," she said finally. "Prepared how? By learning everything I can about running this ranch, building relationships with neighbors who aren't interested in driving me away, and making it clear that I'm not going anywhere." Martha turned to face Ezra directly. "Starting with accepting your offer to help me evaluate the cattle and learn the land." Ezra studied her for a long moment, and Martha had the sense that he was weighing something important in his mind. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Hutchins has money and influence, and he's not the only one who might see a woman alone as an easy target." "Mr. Stone," Martha said, drawing herself up to her full height and meeting his gaze steadily. "I've spent my entire adult life being underestimated by people who thought they knew what I was capable of. I'm tired of proving them right by backing down. This time I'd like to see what happens if I prove them wrong instead." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Ezra nodded slowly and extended his hand. "In that case, Mrs. Whitfield, I'd be honored to help you get started." Martha shook his hand firmly, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work and the strength that had carried her to safety through the storm. It was, she realized, the first time in her life that someone had offered to help her fight rather than suggesting she surrender. It was a good feeling. It was a feeling worth fighting for. And as she looked around at the ranch that was now her home, the mountains that surrounded it, and the man who had become her first and most important ally, Martha Whitfield, felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Let Samuel Hutchins and his threats come. She had work to do. The work began at dawn the next morning, and Martha quickly discovered that everything she thought she knew about hard labor had been merely theoretical until now. Ezra arrived as the first pale light was creeping over the mountain peaks, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the kind of practical clothes that spoke of a man who understood the difference between looking the part and doing the job. "Ready to learn about cattle?" he asked, offering her the coffee with the same matter-of-fact kindness he'd shown since pulling her from the storm. "As ready as someone can be for something they know nothing about," Martha replied, accepting the warmth gratefully. She'd risen before sunrise to make herself as presentable as possible for a day of ranch work which had involved trading her traveling dress for the most practical clothing she owned, a wool skirt, sturdy boots, and a jacket that had seen better days but would serve for outdoor work. Ezra studied her outfit with the critical eye of someone evaluating equipment rather than fashion. "You'll need different clothes if you're going to do this seriously. Skirts and cattle don't mix well, especially when you're working in close quarters." "I don't own anything else," Martha admitted. Cedar Ridge society didn't exactly encourage women to dress for manual labor. "We'll figure something out. For today, stay behind me and watch how the animals react. Cattle are prey animals. They spook easy, and they're strong enough to hurt you if you're not careful." The next several hours proved to be an education in humility, patience, and the fundamental differences between understanding something in theory and managing it in practice. The cattle her aunt had left behind were healthy, but not particularly tame, having spent the better part of a week essentially fending for themselves while Martha made her way from Denver. They eyed the newcomers with the suspicious intelligence of creatures who had learned that humans could mean either food or trouble, depending on their intentions. "That's the bull," Ezra said, pointing to a massive black animal that stood slightly apart from the herd. "Angus, probably about 4 years old. He's the one that keeps the others in line, but he's also the one most likely to charge if he decides you're a threat." Martha studied the animal with the same careful attention she'd once devoted to balancing account books. The bull was beautiful in his own way, sleek, powerful, and utterly unimpressed by the human visitors to his domain. "How do you tell if he's about to charge? He'll lower his head, paw the ground, maybe snort, but the real warning is in his eyes. They'll go hard and fixed if you see that you back away slowly and put something solid between you and him. And if there's nothing solid nearby, then you run like hell and hope you're faster than he is. They spent the morning moving among the cattle, with Ezra pointing out the animals that seemed healthy, the ones that might need attention, and the complex social dynamics that governed herd behavior. Martha learned to read the subtle signs that indicated everything from hunger to illness to the simple bovine equivalent of a bad mood. Your aunt knew what she was doing, Ezra observed as they paused near the water trough. These animals are well bred and well cared for. With proper management, this herd could support a comfortable living. Define comfortable, Martha said, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cool mountain air. Enough to pay your expenses, hire help when you need it, and maybe put a little aside for emergencies. Not wealthy, but independent. Independence. The word had become something of a holy grail for Martha, representing everything she'd been denied in Cedar Ridge and everything she hoped to build here in the mountains. What would I need to do to expand the operation? More land, more cattle, more hands to help manage them, but that's getting ahead of yourself. First, you need to learn to manage what you have. It was practical advice, but Martha found herself thinking beyond the immediate challenges to the possibilities that lay ahead. If she could make the ranch profitable, if she could prove herself capable of succeeding in this harsh but honest environment, then perhaps she could build something lasting, not just a business but a life that belonged entirely to her. Their planning was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and Martha looked up to see a rider coming up the trail at considerable speed. This time, however, the visitor proved to be considerably more welcome than Samuel Hutchins and his men. The woman who dismounted near the barn was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair braided practically down her back, and the kind of weathered features that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged and why she was there. "Ezra Stone," she called out, her voice carrying a mixture of affection and exasperation. "I should have known you'd be mixed up in this somehow." "Hello, Elena," Ezra replied, and Martha caught something in his tone that suggested this woman was more than a casual acquaintance. "This is Martha Whitfield, Beatrice's niece. Martha, this is Elena Vasquez. She runs the spread to the north." Elena approached with her hand extended, and Martha found herself on the receiving end of a handshake that could have crushed walnuts. "Pleased to meet you," Elena said, her dark eyes taking in Martha's appearance with the same practical assessment Ezra had used on her clothes. "I was sorry to hear about Beatrice. She was a good woman and a good neighbor." "Thank you. I'm hoping to follow her example." "Are you now?" Elena's tone suggested that she reserved judgment on that possibility. "Ranching's not easy work, especially for someone without experience." "So I'm learning," Martha replied, "but I'm a fast learner and I have good teachers." Elena glanced meaningfully at Ezra, and Martha caught an undercurrent of communication that she couldn't quite interpret. "I heard Hutchins paid you a visit yesterday," Elena continued. "How did that go?" "About as well as you'd expect," Ezra answered before Martha could respond. "He made his usual offer and his usual threats." "And what did our new neighbor tell him?" "I told him I wasn't selling," Martha said firmly. "This is my home now, and I intend to make it work." Elena studied her for a long moment, and Martha had the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated for qualities that went beyond mere determination. "Good," Elena said finally. "Hutchins has been a cancer on this valley for too long. About time someone stood up to him besides Ezra and me. You've had trouble with him too. Hutchins has had trouble with anyone who won't sell their land to him at cut-rate prices. He's been trying to assemble a cattle empire, and he doesn't much care who gets hurt in the process." Elena's expression hardened. "He tried to buy me out 5 years ago. When I refused, I started losing cattle to accidents and predators. Funny how those problems stopped when I made it clear I'd shoot first and ask questions later. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You think he'll try the same tactics with me? I think he already has, if yesterday's visit was anything like his usual approach. The question is how far you're willing to go to defend what's yours. As far as necessary, Martha replied without hesitation, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. Elena smiled at that, the first genuine warmth Martha had seen from her. Then you might just make it after all, but you'll need more than determination. You'll need practical skills, reliable help, and neighbors you can count on when things get difficult. I'm hoping to learn the first hire the second and earn the third. Smart woman, Elena turned to Ezra. How long are you planning to stay involved in this? The question seemed loaded with meaning that Martha couldn't entirely grasp, but she saw Ezra's jaw tighten slightly. As long as she needs help getting established, he replied carefully, and after that, we'll see. Elena nodded as if this answer satisfied some concern Martha wasn't aware of. In that case, I have a proposition for both of you. She went on to explain that several of the smaller ranchers in the valley had been discussing the idea of forming an informal cooperative sharing resources, coordinating cattle drives, and presenting a united front against larger operations that tried to muscle them out. Beatrice was interested before she died, Elena said. Said it made sense for the smaller operations to work together instead of letting ourselves get picked off one by one. What would that involve? Martha asked. Shared grazing rights during dry seasons, joint purchases of supplies to get better prices, and mutual support when anyone has trouble with outside pressure. In your case, it would also mean experienced ranchers helping you learn the business in exchange for access to your water rights during summer months. It was an attractive offer, and Martha could see the practical benefits immediately, but she was also aware that accepting help from neighbors would make her part of a community in ways that might limit her independence. I'd like to think about it, she said finally. Of course, but don't take too long. Hutchins has been sniffing around other properties lately, and I suspect he's planning something bigger than his usual intimidation tactics. Elena stayed for another hour helping Ezra show Martha the finer points of cattle management and sharing stories about her aunt that painted a picture of a woman who had been both respected and beloved by her neighbors. When she finally left, it was with a promise to return the following week with some practical clothing that might serve Martha better than her current wardrobe. She likes you, Ezra observed as they watched Elena ride away. How can you tell? She didn't try to talk you out of staying. Elena has strong opinions about who belongs in this valley and who doesn't. If she thought you were going to fail, she would have told you so directly. Martha found herself oddly pleased by this assessment. Elena Vasquez struck her as the kind of woman who didn't suffer fools gladly, and earning her provisional approval felt like a significant accomplishment. The rest of the week fell into a pattern that was both exhausting and exhilarating. Ezra arrived each morning at dawn, and they spent the days learning the rhythms of ranch life, feeding cattle, checking water sources, repairing fences, and gradually expanding Martha's understanding of what it meant to make a living from the land. In the evenings, after Ezra had returned to his own cabin, Martha sat by the fire in her aunt's house and wrote detailed notes about everything she'd learned. The work was harder than anything she'd ever attempted, but it was also more satisfying than anything she'd ever done. Each small success, learning to approach a skittish cow without spooking it, repairing a section of fence that would hold against wind and weather, understanding the subtle signs that indicated a problem before it became a crisis, felt like a victory earned rather than a gift bestowed. It was on Friday evening, as she was reviewing her notes by lamplight, that the first real test of her resolve arrived. She heard the horses before she saw them, multiple riders approaching at speed in the gathering dusk. Through the window she could make out at least 4 mounted figures, and something about their approach set every instinct she possessed on high alert. Martha rose quietly and moved to the gun cabinet her aunt had left behind. Among Beatrice's possessions was a well-maintained rifle and a smaller pistol that looked as if it had seen regular use. Martha had never fired either weapon, but Ezra had shown her the basics of loading and aiming earlier in the week. The riders pulled up in her yard with considerably less ceremony than Hutchins had shown during his previous visit. These men didn't dismount or call out greetings. Instead, they sat their horses in a loose semicircle, facing the house, their intentions unclear, but definitely not social. Martha stepped onto the porch with the rifle in her hands, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Good evening, gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "Can I help you with something?" Mrs. Whitfield. The speaker was a man she didn't recognize, younger than Hutchins, with the kind of face that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being told no. "I'm Jake Morrison, Mr. Hutchins' foreman. We need to talk." "About what?" "About some cattle that wandered onto Broken H property. Seems like your fences might not be as secure as they should be." Martha felt her stomach clench. Missing cattle could be a serious financial blow, especially when she was just getting started, but something about Morrison's tone suggested that this wasn't a neighborly warning about strayed livestock. "How many cattle?" she asked. 6 head, prime stock too. Mr. Hutchins is concerned about the precedent this sets. Can't have cattle wandering wherever they please." "Of course not. I'll come collect them in the morning." "Well, that's the thing," Morrison continued, his voice taking on a tone of false regret. "Cattle that graze on another man's land without permission, that's technically rustling. Mr. Hutchins would be within his rights to keep them as compensation for the grass they ate." The threat was clear, and Martha felt anger begin to burn in her chest. This was exactly the kind of pressure Elena had warned her about, manufactured problems designed to cost her money and make ranch life seem impossible. "Those cattle will be returned to my property," she said firmly, raising the rifle to rest across her arms in a position that was casual but unmistakably ready. "Tonight." "Now, Mrs. Whitfield, there's no need for hostility. We're just trying to work out a neighborly solution to a problem. The neighborly solution is for you to return my livestock immediately. The alternative is for me to ride to town tomorrow and swear out a complaint with the territorial marshal about cattle theft." Morrison's expression hardened, and Martha saw his hand move toward the gun at his hip. The other riders shifted in their saddles, and she realized that the situation was about to escalate beyond mere verbal threats. That was when the sound of approaching hoofbeats came from the direction of Ezra's cabin, and relief flooded through Martha's chest as she recognized his distinctive silhouette against the darkening sky. Ezra rode into the yard with his rifle across his saddle and his attention fixed entirely on the unwelcome visitors. He didn't speak immediately, but his presence changed the dynamics of the confrontation in ways that were immediately apparent. "Stone." Morrison acknowledged, his voice considerably less confident than it had been moments before. "Morrison." Ezra's tone was flat professional and completely devoid of warmth. "What brings you to Mrs. Whitfield's property?" "Ranch business, nothing that concerns you." "Everything that happens to my neighbors concerns me," Ezra replied, dismounting but keeping his rifle handy. "Especially when it involves 4 armed men showing up after dark." Martha watched the interplay between the two men and realized that she was witnessing something more complex than a simple dispute over cattle. There was history here and tension that went deeper than the current conflict. "We're discussing some cattle that strayed onto Broken H land," Morrison said, but his attention was clearly focused on Ezra rather than Martha. "Strayed or were driven?" Ezra asked quietly. "That's a serious accusation, Stone." "It's a serious situation, Morrison. 4 men armed threatening a woman alone on her own property. Some might call that more than rustling." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken threats and the weight of possibilities that no one wanted to voice directly. Martha found herself holding her breath, acutely aware that decisions made in the next few minutes could determine whether her conflict with Hutchins remained a matter of business pressure or escalated into something far more dangerous. "Tell Hutchins the cattle will be returned by noon tomorrow," Ezra said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had given orders in situations where lives depended on being obeyed. "All of them in good condition. If they're not, I'll be paying him a personal visit to discuss the matter." Morrison stared at him for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded curtly to his men, and they began turning their horses toward the trail. "This isn't over," he called back as they rode away. "No," Ezra agreed quietly. "It's not." Martha waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before lowering the rifle, only then realizing that her hands were shaking. "Are you all right?" Ezra asked, moving toward the porch. "I think so. Thank you for coming when you did. I'm not sure how that would have ended otherwise. Morrison's a bully, but he's not stupid. He wouldn't have tried anything serious with witnesses around. Still, you handled yourself well." Martha looked down at the rifle in her hands, surprised by how natural it had felt to hold it, to use it as an extension of her will rather than just a tool. "I've never threatened anyone with a gun before," she said, "but you would have used it if you had to." It wasn't a question, and Martha realized that Ezra had seen something in her response to the threat that even she hadn't fully recognized. "Yes," she said simply, "I would have." "Good. That's what it takes to survive out here, the willingness to defend what's yours when words aren't enough." They stood together in the gathering darkness, and Martha felt something shift between them. Not just gratitude for his timely arrival, but a deeper recognition of partnership in something that was becoming larger than her simple desire to claim her inheritance. "Ezra," she said quietly, "when Morrison mentioned rustling, you asked if the cattle were driven rather than strayed. Do you think Hutchins is actively stealing from me? I think Hutchins is testing you, seeing how you respond to pressure, how much you know about ranch law, whether you have anyone willing to back you up when things get difficult." Ezra leaned against the porch railing, his expression thoughtful. Tonight gave him some of those answers. And what did he learn? That you're not going to be intimidated easily, that you have neighbors willing to stand with you, and that escalating this conflict is going to cost him more than he might have expected. Martha nodded slowly, understanding that she had passed some kind of test, not just in Hutchins's eyes, but in her own. The woman who had stood on this porch with a rifle in her hands was not the same person who had fled Cedar Ridge in search of a new life. This woman was harder, more determined, and considerably more dangerous when threatened. "What happens next?" she asked. "We get your cattle back. We strengthen your fences and improve your security. And we make it clear to anyone who's interested that you're here to stay, regardless of what obstacles they might try to put in your way." The simple certainty in his voice warmed Martha more than the promise of returned livestock or improved defenses. For the first time in her life, she had found someone who didn't just believe in her ability to succeed, but was willing to help her fight for that success. "Thank you," she said again, but this time the words carried weight that went far beyond gratitude for a single evening's intervention. "Don't thank me yet," Ezra replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he understood exactly what she meant. "We're just getting started." As if to emphasize his point, the distant sound of cattle lowing drifted across the valley, and Martha realized that her missing livestock were already being driven home through the darkness, returned not out of neighborly kindness, but because Hutchins had decided that this particular battle wasn't worth the cost of fighting it. It was a small victory, but it felt significant in ways that went beyond the value of 6 head of cattle. It was proof that she could stand her ground, that she had allies when she needed them, and that the life she was building here was worth defending. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and resourcefulness. But tonight, standing on her own porch beside a man who had proven himself willing to face down armed threats, on her behalf, Martha Whitfield felt something she had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And if that meant fighting for it, so be it. She was beginning to understand that the best things in life were worth fighting for. The cattle were returned before dawn, driven quietly through darkness by men who clearly wanted to avoid another confrontation. Martha heard them coming and rose from her bed to watch from the window as her livestock were herded back into the pasture where they belonged. The message was clear. Hutchins had decided that this particular test wasn't worth pursuing further. But if Martha had expected the return of her cattle to mark the end of her troubles, she was quickly proven wrong. The confrontation with Morrison had been merely the opening move in a campaign that would test not just her determination, but her ability to build something lasting in the face of sustained opposition. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that was as predictable as it was frustrating. Tools would go missing from the barn only to be found days later in places where they clearly didn't belong. Sections of fence would be damaged by what appeared to be random vandalism requiring time and money to repair. Cattle would be found in the wrong pastures, suggesting that gates had been left open by someone other than Martha or Ezra. None of these incidents were serious enough to justify involving the territorial marshal, but they were constant enough to make ranch life feel like a series of small sieges. Martha found herself checking and double-checking everything, developing the kind of vigilance that came from knowing that someone was actively working to make her life difficult. "It's psychological warfare," Elena explained during one of her weekly visits, which had become as regular as Sunday church services. "Hutchins is trying to wear you down, make you feel like every day brings new problems that you can't solve. And it's working," Martha admitted, accepting the cup of coffee Elena had prepared with the automatic competence of someone who had been managing her own household for decades. "I spend more time fixing problems than actually learning to ranch." That's the point. He wants you to feel overwhelmed, isolated, and convinced that selling is the only reasonable solution to your troubles. They were sitting on Martha's front porch in the warm afternoon sun, watching Ezra work with a young horse in the corral he'd built near the barn. The sight had become a daily pleasure for Martha, not just because Ezra had a natural gift for working with animals, but because his presence had transformed the ranch from a lonely outpost into something that felt like home. "What would you do," Martha asked, "if you were in my position?" "What I did when Hutchins tried the same tactics on me," Elena replied without hesitation. "I made it clear that every action has consequences, and that I was prepared to make those consequences more expensive than he wanted to pay." Meaning I started fighting back instead of just defending. When my fences were cut, I made sure his were cut too. When my cattle went missing, his started disappearing as well. When his men showed up to intimidate me, I showed up at his ranch with enough firepower to make my position clear. Martha considered this, watching Ezra gentle the young horse, with a patience that seemed infinite. The idea of actively retaliating against Hutchins held a certain appeal, but it also represented a level of escalation that she wasn't sure she was prepared for. And that worked, eventually, but it also made me a lot of enemies, and it required a willingness to live with the consequences of my choices. Elena's expression grew serious. "That's not a decision I can make for you, Martha. You have to decide for yourself how far you're willing to go to protect what's yours." It was a conversation that stayed with Martha long after Elena had ridden home, and one that took on new urgency when the pattern of harassment suddenly escalated beyond mere inconvenience. She woke one morning to discover that someone had poisoned the water trough near the barn, killing 3 of her cattle and threatening the health of the entire herd. The loss was devastating, both financially and emotionally. Martha had grown attached to each animal in ways that surprised her, learning their individual personalities and quirks as she worked with them daily. But more than the immediate loss, the poisoning represented a line crossed. This wasn't harassment or intimidation anymore. It was a direct attack on her livelihood and her ability to survive as an independent rancher. Ezra arrived to find Martha standing over the dead cattle with tears streaming down her face, not from grief alone, but from rage that threatened to consume her entirely. "They were healthy yesterday," she said without looking up as he approached. "I checked the water trough myself before bed. Someone did this deliberately." Ezra knelt beside the nearest carcass, examining the foam around its mouth and the position of the body. His expression was grim when he stood. "Strychnine," he said quietly. "Quick but not pleasant. Whoever did this wanted to send a message. Then the message is received." Martha's voice was steady now, but Ezra could hear the steel beneath the surface. "What's the law regarding cattle poisoning in this territory?" "It's a hanging offense if you can prove who did it, but proving it is the hard part." "Then I suppose I'll have to get creative about gathering proof." Something in her tone made Ezra look at her more closely. The woman standing beside the dead cattle was not the same person he'd rescued from the storm weeks earlier. That woman had been strong and determined, but this one was something harder, forged by adversity into someone who was prepared to fight fire with fire. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that Elena was right about fighting back. I'm thinking that playing defense isn't working, and it's time to try a different approach." Martha turned to face him fully, and Ezra saw something in her eyes that reminded him of his own reflection after particularly difficult battles during the war. "I'm thinking that whoever did this is expecting me to be devastated and demoralized. Instead, I want them to realize they've made a serious mistake." "And how do you propose to do that?" "By making sure this is the last time anyone underestimates what I'm capable of." The plan that Martha developed over the following days was simple in concept, but complex in execution. If Hutchins wanted to play psychological warfare, she would give him a taste of his own medicine, but with a precision and intelligence that would make it clear she was not the helpless victim he'd assumed her to be. Working with both Ezra and Elena, Martha began gathering evidence of Hutchins' campaign against her. They documented every instance of vandalism, every suspicious incident, every threat made by his men. More importantly, they began watching his operation as carefully as he was watching hers, learning the patterns of his business and identifying vulnerabilities he might not even realize he had. "Information is power," Elena observed as they reviewed their notes one evening in Martha's kitchen. "Hutchins has been operating under the assumption that he knows everything about his opponents while they know nothing about him. Time to change that dynamic." The opportunity to put their plan into action came sooner than expected. Through careful observation, they learned that Hutchins was planning to drive a large herd to market in Denver, a valuable shipment that represented months of work and significant profit. More importantly, the route would take his cattle through territory where Martha and her allies could observe and potentially interfere with the operation. "We're not going to steal his cattle," Martha made clear as they finalized their strategy. "We're going to make sure he understands that his actions have consequences, and that those consequences can be as expensive and inconvenient as he chooses to make them." The execution of their plan required timing, coordination, and a level of boldness that surprised even Martha herself. On the morning of Hutchins' cattle drive, she and Ezra positioned themselves along the route with enough supplies to make themselves comfortable for several days of observation. What they discovered was that Hutchins' operation, while large and profitable, was not as well managed as he wanted people to believe. His men were careless with their security, his cattle were not as well trained as they could have been, and his route took him through territory where a determined opponent could cause significant delays and problems. Martha didn't attack the herd directly. Instead, she began a campaign of strategic interference that was designed to cost Hutchins time, money, and peace of mind without crossing the legal lines that would justify retaliation. Gates that should have remained open were mysteriously closed, forcing the herd to take longer routes around obstacles. Water sources that the cattle needed were temporarily diverted, requiring Hutchins' men to spend valuable time finding alternatives. Most effectively, Martha began spreading rumors in the towns along the route about the quality of Hutchins' cattle and his business practices, undermining his reputation in ways that would cost him customers and future profits. "This is impressive work," Ezra observed as they watched Hutchins' frustrated men deal with yet another mysterious delay in their progress. "You have a talent for this kind of strategic thinking." "I learned it managing inventory and dealing with difficult customers," Martha replied, but she was pleased by his assessment. "The principles are the same. Understand your opponent's weaknesses, exploit their mistakes, and always stay several steps ahead of their thinking." The cattle drive that should have taken 5 days stretched into 2 weeks, costing Hutchins not just money, but credibility with the buyers in Denver, who were expecting his herd to arrive on schedule. More importantly, word began to spread throughout the territory that the powerful Samuel Hutchins was having difficulty managing a simple cattle drive, a development that undermined his reputation for efficiency and competence. But Martha's most effective stroke came not from direct interference with the cattle drive, but from the information Elena had helped her gather about Hutchins' business practices. Through careful investigation, they had discovered that Hutchins had been systematically underreporting his profits to avoid territorial taxes, a practice that was not only illegal but potentially serious enough to result in criminal charges. Rather than confronting Hutchins directly with this information, Martha chose a more subtle approach. She sent an anonymous letter to the Territorial Tax Office, including detailed documentation of the discrepancies in Hutchins' reported income and the evidence that supported her allegations. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough, resulting in not just significant penalties for back taxes, but a level of scrutiny that would make it much more difficult for Hutchins to operate outside the law in the future. "You've cost him more than money," Elena observed when they learned of the tax investigation's results. "You've cost him the kind of reputation that takes years to build and can't be bought back with cattle sales." "Good," Martha replied without sympathy. "He earned every bit of trouble he's getting." But if Martha had hoped that demonstrating her ability to fight back would end the conflict with Hutchins, she was quickly proven wrong. Instead of deterring him, her success seemed to have enraged him to the point where subtlety was no longer part of his strategy. The escalation came on a cold November morning when Martha woke to find her barn on fire. She fought the blaze with everything she had, assisted by Ezra and several neighbors who had seen the smoke and come to help. But by the time the flames were extinguished, she had lost not just the building, but most of the winter feed she had stored for her cattle, along with tools and equipment that represented months of careful investment. Standing in the smoking ruins of what had been her most important outbuilding, Martha felt something inside her snap. This wasn't harassment anymore, or even financial warfare. This was a direct attempt to destroy her ability to survive the winter, and everyone present knew it. "This is arson," declared Tom Bradley, one of the neighboring ranchers who had helped fight the fire. "Pure and simple. Someone set this deliberately." "Can you prove that?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not in a way that would stand up in territorial court, but everyone in this valley knows who benefits from driving you out of business." Martha looked around at the faces of her neighbors' people, who had gradually come to accept her presence and respect her determination to succeed despite the obstacles she faced. They were angry, she realized, not just on her behalf, but because the barn fire represented an escalation that threatened all of them. "What would you do?" she asked Elena, who had arrived with her sons to help with the firefighting effort. "What I told you before, I'd make sure the consequences were immediate and personal." "And what would those consequences look like?" Elena's smile was not pleasant. "Hutchins has a new barn himself, built it last spring to replace one that burned down in an accidental fire. Be a shame if he had another accident so soon." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the ruined barn, and Martha felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She could continue to play by rules that Hutchins had clearly abandoned, or she could accept that this conflict had moved beyond the realm of civilized business disputes. "I need to think about this," Martha said finally. Don't think too long, Tom Bradley advised. Winter's coming, and without that barn, you're going to have a hard time keeping your cattle alive through the cold months. That evening, as Martha sat in her kitchen reviewing the financial impact of the barn fire, Ezra made a suggestion that surprised her. "Marry me," he said quietly. Martha looked up from her calculations, certain she had misheard. "What? Marry me?" Ezra repeated, his voice steady, but his eyes showing the strain of a man making a difficult decision. "Not for love, though I've come to care about you more than I expected. Not for romance, though there's been something building between us that we've both been trying to ignore. Marry me because it's practical." Practical how? Because a married woman has legal protections that a woman alone doesn't have. Because an attack on my wife would be an attack on me, and everyone in this territory knows I'm not someone they want to make an enemy of. Ezra leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because Hutchins is escalating this conflict beyond what you can handle alone, and you need more than good neighbors to protect what you've built." Martha set down her pen and studied the man who had become so much more than the stranger who had rescued her from a storm. Over the weeks they had worked together, she had come to respect his intelligence, depend on his loyalty, and yes, feel drawn to him in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or convenience. "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" she asked. "A partner, someone who understands what it means to fight for what you believe in, someone who's proven she can hold her own in a world that doesn't make things easy." Ezra's voice softened. "Someone who makes me remember what it feels like to care about something beyond mere survival." It was not a declaration of love, but it was something deeper, an acknowledgement of connection that had grown between them through shared hardship and mutual respect. Martha realized that what he was offering was exactly what she had always wanted: a partnership of equals, built on understanding rather than need. "There's something you should know," Martha said slowly, "about the inheritance. My aunt's will required me to be married within a year of her death. I've been telling people I was already married to avoid questions, but the truth is that I need to find a husband by next spring or lose everything." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, and Martha held her breath, wondering if her confession would change his offer or make him question her motives. "So we both benefit from this arrangement," he said finally. "That makes it honest, which is more than most marriages can claim." "It does," Martha agreed, "but I won't trap you into something you don't really want, if you're making this offer out of pity or obligation." "Martha," Ezra interrupted, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I've been alone for 5 years. I thought I preferred it that way, thought I was better off without complications or responsibilities to anyone else. But working with you, watching you build something important, despite every obstacle that's been thrown at you, it's made me realize that some things are worth the risk of caring about them." His hand was warm and calloused, marked by the same kind of honest work that had begun to change Martha's own soft palms into something more practical. Looking into his eyes, she saw not pity or obligation, but the same recognition she felt that they had found in each other, something rare and valuable. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. For practical reasons and honest ones. Because I respect you and trust you, and because I think we can build something together that neither of us could manage alone." Ezra smiled then, the same genuine expression that had warmed her during those first difficult days in his cabin. But this time, the warmth was accompanied by something deeper, the acknowledgement that they were choosing each other not from desperation or convenience, but from a clear-eyed understanding of what they could accomplish as partners. "There's one more thing," Martha said, still holding his hand. "If we do this, if we become partners in truth as well as name, then the decisions about how to handle Hutchins become ours to make together. I won't be protected while you take all the risks." "I wouldn't expect anything else," Ezra replied. "Though I should warn you, my approach to problem solving tends to be more direct than yours. After tonight, I'm thinking that direct might be exactly what the situation calls for. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony performed by the traveling preacher who made monthly rounds through the mountain communities. Elena and Tom Bradley served as witnesses, and the celebration afterward consisted of coffee and cake shared with the neighbors who had become Martha's unexpected allies. It was not the wedding Martha had dreamed of as a young woman in Cedar Ridge, but it was something better, a partnership entered into with open eyes and honest intentions, witnessed by people who understood the challenges they would face and respected their determination to face them together. The honeymoon, such as it was, lasted exactly one night before the practical realities of their situation reasserted themselves. Hutchins had apparently learned of the marriage through the territorial gossip network that connected every community in the region, and his response was swift and unmistakably threatening. Martha and Ezra woke to find a dead steer hanging from the tree in their front yard, its throat cut and its blood staining the snow beneath it. Pinned to the carcass was a note that read simply, "Congratulations on your marriage. Hope it lasts longer than your cattle." Standing on their porch in the pale morning light, looking at the grotesque wedding gift that someone had left for them during the night, Martha felt the last vestiges of her civilized restraint disappear entirely. "He's made this personal now," she said quietly. "Yes, he has." Ezra agreed, his voice carrying the same cold fury that Martha felt building in her own chest. "Then I suppose it's time to return the favor." What followed was not the gradual escalation of harassment that had characterized the conflict thus far, but a swift and decisive campaign that demonstrated exactly what Martha Whitfield Stone was capable of when someone threatened her family. Working together with a precision that surprised even their allies, Martha and Ezra struck at every vulnerable point in Hutchins' operation simultaneously. His cattle contracts were undermined by carefully placed rumors about the quality of his stock. His credit was damaged by strategic conversations with territorial bankers about his questionable business practices. His reputation was destroyed by the systematic exposure of his illegal activities to the appropriate authorities. But their most effective attack was also their most personal. Using the intelligence they had gathered about his operation, Martha and Ezra orchestrated the theft of Hutchins' prize breeding bull, not to keep the animal but to demonstrate that his security was inadequate and his threats could be answered in kind. The bull was returned unharmed after 3 days, but the message was clear. Martha Stone was not a victim to be intimidated, but an opponent capable of striking back with interest. The war ended not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet capitulation. Faced with mounting legal troubles, financial losses, and the realization that his opponents were more resourceful than he had anticipated, Hutchins made the pragmatic decision to cut his losses and redirect his attention to easier targets. By spring, the harassment had stopped entirely, and Martha found herself in possession of not just her inheritance, but something more valuable, the respect of her neighbors and the certainty that she had found her place in the world. Standing on her porch on a warm May morning, watching Ezra work with their growing herd in the pasture below, Martha felt a contentment that had nothing to do with victory over her enemies and everything to do with the life she had built. Through determination, courage, and the unexpected discovery of love that had grown from partnership. The woman who had fled Cedar Ridge in desperate search of independence had found something better, a home where she belonged, work that challenged and fulfilled her, and a partner who saw her exactly as she was and chose to stand beside her anyway. It was Martha reflected as she prepared to join her husband in the daily work of ranching everything she had never dared to hope for and more than she had ever thought possible. The mountain valley that had once seemed like exile had become the place where Martha Whitfield had finally learned to be Martha Stone, a woman who took up exactly as much space as she needed and made no apologies for the room she required to live her life fully and honestly, and that she thought as she walked toward the corral where Ezra was waiting for her was worth every struggle it had taken to get there. The seasons that followed their victory over Hutchins brought changes to the mountain valley that Martha could never have anticipated when she first stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but determination and her aunt's mysterious inheritance. What had begun as a desperate flight from a life that no longer fit had evolved into something far more significant, not just a personal transformation, but the foundation of a legacy that would reshape the entire community. Martha discovered she was carrying Ezra's child on a crisp October morning exactly 1 year after their marriage, when the aspen trees were painting the mountainsides in shades of gold that seemed to mirror the warmth spreading through her chest. She had suspected for weeks, but the confirmation came with a mixture of joy and terror that left her sitting on the edge of their bed staring at her reflection in the mirror and wondering how someone who had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of love had come to possess so much of it. "You're quiet this morning," Ezra observed, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of gentle attention that had become as natural as breathing between them. "I'm thinking," Martha replied, accepting the coffee but not drinking it. The smell that had once been comforting now made her stomach rebel, in ways that confirmed what she already knew. About anything in particular, Martha met his eyes in the mirror, seeing her own wonder reflected back at her. About how sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected directions. Something in her tone made Ezra set down his own cup and move to sit beside her on the bed, his large frame making the mattress dip in a way that had her automatically leaning against his warmth. "Martha," he said quietly, "are you telling me what I think you're telling me? I'm telling you that come next spring we're going to need to make some adjustments to our household arrangements." She turned to face him, fully searching his expression for any sign of the panic she felt. "I'm telling you that our partnership is about to expand in ways we hadn't planned for." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Martha to begin questioning whether this unexpected development was as welcome as she had hoped. Then Ezra's face broke into a smile that was so purely joyful it took her breath away. "A baby," he said wonderingly, as if testing the words. "Our baby." "Are you pleased?" Martha asked, realizing only as she spoke how much his answer mattered to her. "Pleased?" Ezra's laugh was rich with disbelief and delight. "Martha, I never thought, after the war, after everything that happened, I never imagined I'd have the chance to be a father, to build something lasting with someone He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to the moment. "Someone you what?" Martha prompted gently. "Someone I love." Ezra finished simply, and Martha felt her heart stop entirely before resuming at double speed. It was the first time either of them had used that word, though the feeling had been growing between them for months, like wildflowers taking root in fertile soil. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, but it had become something deeper through shared struggles, mutual respect, and the gradual recognition that they were better together than either had ever been alone. "I love you too," Martha replied, the words feeling both natural and revolutionary, "more than I ever thought possible." They sat together in the morning light, holding each other and contemplating the magnitude of the changes ahead. A child would transform not just their personal lives, but their entire operation. The ranch would need to become not just profitable, but stable enough to support a family, and their home would need to evolve from a refuge for 2 independent souls into something that could nurture new life. "We'll need help," Martha said, practically, her mind already moving toward the logistics of managing a ranch while raising a child. "Someone to assist with the daily work when I can't do as much." "Elena's oldest boy has been looking for steady work," Ezra suggested. "Miguel's 17, knows cattle, and he's been helping his mother manage their place since his father died. She might be willing to let him work for us part-time. And we'll need to expand the house, add a proper nursery, maybe enlarge the kitchen to accommodate a larger household." "I can handle the construction," Ezra said, his practical mind already engaged with the challenges ahead. "But Martha, how do you feel about all this, really?" It was a question that went deeper than mere logistics, touching on fears and hopes that Martha had barely begun to examine. The idea of becoming a mother had always seemed as remote as the possibility of finding genuine love, something that happened to other women, women who fit more easily into society's expectations of what female success looked like. Terrified, Martha admitted honestly, and excited and grateful in ways I don't have words for. She leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. I never thought I'd have this chance, Ezra, to create life, to raise a child who will know from the beginning that they're wanted and valued exactly as they are. They will be, Ezra said firmly. Whatever else happens, our child will grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally. The pregnancy progressed through the winter months with a mixture of challenges and wonders that kept Martha constantly amazed by her body's capacity for change. Elena proved to be an invaluable source of practical advice, having raised 5 children of her own, while the other women in the valley rallied around Martha with the kind of support she had never experienced during her years in Cedar Ridge. It's different here, she confided to Elena, during one of their weekly visits, watching her friend's capable hands work on the baby quilt that seemed to appear from nowhere through the collective efforts of the mountain women. In town, pregnancy was something that happened to married women as a matter of course. Here it feels like a gift the whole community is celebrating. Because it is, Elena replied simply. Children are precious in country like this. Every new life represents hope for the future, proof that we're building something that will last beyond our own lifetimes. The truth of that observation became evident as word of Martha's pregnancy spread throughout the valley. Neighbors who had initially viewed her with skepticism now spoke of her with something approaching reverence, not because she was carrying a child, but because she represented the possibility of renewal and continuity in a landscape that could be harsh and unforgiving. Tom Bradley stopped by one afternoon to discuss the possibility of expanding their informal cooperative into something more structured, with Martha and Ezra's ranch serving as a central hub for coordinated cattle operations. You've proven you can hold your own against outside pressure, he explained, settling into a chair by their fireplace while Martha continued her mending and Ezra carved wooden toys that their child wouldn't need for years. But more than that, you've shown you understand the importance of community. That's what we need to build something lasting here. What exactly are you proposing? Martha asked, intrigued by the possibilities he was suggesting. A formal ranchers association, shared resources, coordinated marketing, mutual protection against anyone who tries to muscle in on our territory. With your business sense and Ezra's knowledge of the country, you two could be the foundation that holds it all together. It was an ambitious vision, one that would transform their isolated mountain valley into a thriving agricultural community capable of competing with larger operations while maintaining its independence. Martha found herself energized by the prospect of building something that would benefit not just her own family, but the entire region. I'm interested, she said, meeting Ezra's approving nod with a smile. But I want to make sure we're building something that can adapt and grow. I don't want to create just another version of the kind of rigid hierarchy that drove me away from Cedar Ridge in the first place. What would you suggest instead? A true cooperative. Decisions made democratically, profits shared fairly, and leadership that rotates so no one person or family accumulates too much power. Martha set down her mending, warming to the topic. I want to build something where a woman like me, or our daughter, if that's what we're having, could have a voice and a future without having to fight for basic respect. The conversation that followed lasted well into the evening, with Elena and several other neighbors joining the discussion as word spread that important plans were being made. By the time everyone went home, they had outlined the structure of what would become the Mountain Valley Ranchers Association, an organization that would serve as a model for cooperative agriculture throughout the territory. Spring arrived with the birth of their daughter on a morning when the snow was finally melting and the first wildflowers were beginning to push through the still frozen ground. Martha labored through the night with Elena and Dr. Hayes, the traveling physician who had agreed to stay in the valley until the baby arrived, providing her with the kind of medical care that had once been unthinkable for a woman in her circumstances. Rose Elena Stone came into the world with a voice that announced her presence to the entire mountain valley, her cries echoing off the surrounding peaks, as if declaring her intention to claim her place in the world without apology. Martha held her daughter for the first time and felt something shift inside her chest. Not just love, though that was overwhelming in its intensity, but a fierce protectiveness that made her earlier battles with Hutchins seem like mere preparation for this moment. "She's perfect," Ezra whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as he gazed down at the tiny face that seemed to blend the best features of both parents. "She's ours," Martha replied, and the simple possessive pronoun carried more weight than any legal document or formal declaration ever could. The weeks that followed Rose's birth were a blur of sleepless nights, constant feeding, and the gradual adjustment to life as a family of three. Martha discovered that motherhood, like ranching, required skills that couldn't be learned from books: intuition, patience, and the ability to make critical decisions with incomplete information and exhausted judgment. But she also discovered something unexpected: the profound satisfaction of nurturing new life while simultaneously building something lasting for that life to inherit. Every day brought small victories: Rose's first smile, her growing recognition of her parents' voices, the gradual establishment of routines that made their household function smoothly despite the chaos of caring for an infant. "You're a natural at this," Elena observed during one of her visits, watching Martha nurse Rose while simultaneously reviewing the latest proposals for the Ranchers Association. "I don't feel natural at it," Martha admitted. "I feel like I'm learning as I go and hoping I don't make any irreversible mistakes." "That's exactly what being a natural parent means," Elena replied with a laugh. "The ones who think they know everything from the beginning are the ones you need to worry about." As Rose grew from a helpless infant into a curious baby who could sit up and examine her world with intelligent eyes, Martha began to understand how profoundly parenthood had changed not just her daily routine, but her entire perspective on the future. Every decision she made about the ranch, about the Ranchers Association, about her place in the community, was now filtered through the question of what kind of world she was building for her daughter to inherit. It was this long-term thinking that led to her most ambitious project, yet the establishment of a school for the valley's children. The nearest formal education was a 3-day ride away, and Martha had watched too many bright children grow up without the tools they needed to expand their opportunities beyond ranching. "Education is freedom," she explained to the Ranchers Association during their monthly meeting with Rose, sleeping peacefully in a basket at her feet. "Our children deserve the same opportunities as children in Denver or San Francisco. They deserve to choose their own paths, whether that means staying here and building on what we've created or going out into the wider world to pursue their dreams." The proposal met with mixed reactions. Some of the older ranchers worried about the expense and the potential for education to draw their children away from the land. Others questioned whether a woman, even one who had proven herself as capable as Martha, was qualified to organize something as important as their children's education. But the debate was settled by an unexpected voice, Rose herself, who chose that moment to wake up and add her own commentary to the discussion in the form of enthusiastic babbling that made everyone laugh and remember why they were having the conversation in the first place. "Our children are our future," Tom Bradley said finally. "If Martha thinks they need a school, then I think we should listen to her." The school project consumed much of Martha's energy over the following year, requiring her to correspond with territorial education officials, recruit qualified teachers, and coordinate with parents throughout the valley to ensure that the curriculum would meet their children's needs. It was challenging work, made more difficult by the constant demands of caring for a toddler who had inherited her parents' determination and applied it to exploring every corner of their ranch. But the challenges were offset by the support Martha received from unexpected quarters. Word of the Mountain Valley School reached sympathetic ears in Denver and beyond, resulting in donations of books, supplies, and equipment from people who believed in the importance of education for frontier children. More importantly, the project attracted attention from other rural communities facing similar challenges, leading to a network of correspondence and mutual support that expanded Martha's influence far beyond her mountain valley. "You're becoming famous," Ezra observed one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Rose chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I saw an article about the school in the Denver newspaper. They called you a visionary leader in frontier education. They also called me the remarkable Mrs. Stone who defied convention to build a new life in the mountains." Martha replied with amusement. "I suspect they're more interested in the story than the actual education we're providing. Does that bother you?" Martha considered the question as she watched their daughter's delighted pursuit of the glowing insects. 2 years ago, she would have been mortified by public attention, convinced that any notice would inevitably focus on her physical appearance or unconventional circumstances. Now she found she cared less about how her story was told than about the concrete results it produced. "No," she said finally. "If telling my story helps other women believe they can change their circumstances, if it encourages more communities to prioritize education for their children, then I'm willing to be famous for it." The school opened in the fall of Rose's second year, housed in a building constructed through the combined efforts of every family in the valley. Martha served as the first teacher, drawing on her years of self-education and her experience managing complex projects to create an educational environment that was both academically rigorous and practically relevant to their students' lives. Teaching proved to be another unexpected talent, as Martha discovered she had a gift for making complex subjects accessible and for recognizing the unique strengths each child brought to their learning. The students ranged in age from 6 to 16, representing varying levels of previous education, but all shared a hunger for knowledge that made every day in the classroom a joy despite the challenges. "You should see her with those children," Elena confided to Tom Bradley during one of their visits to observe the school in action. "She has them studying literature and mathematics with the same enthusiasm they usually reserve for learning to rope cattle." More importantly, Tom replied, watching Martha help one of the younger students work through a particularly challenging arithmetic problem, "She has them believing they can accomplish anything they set their minds to. That's worth more than all the book learning in the world." The success of the school attracted attention from territorial officials, leading to formal recognition and modest funding that helped ensure its long-term sustainability. But more importantly, it demonstrated to the children of the Mountain Valley that education was not just a luxury for wealthy families in distant cities, but a fundamental right that their community was committed to providing. As Rose grew from a toddler into a precocious 4-year-old who insisted on accompanying her mother to school every day, Martha began to see the fruits of all her efforts taking shape in ways that exceeded her wildest dreams. The Ranchers Association had evolved into a model of cooperative agriculture that was being studied by agricultural colleges across the territory. The school had become a source of pride for the entire valley and a destination for educators seeking to understand innovative approaches to frontier education. Most importantly, the community itself had transformed from a collection of isolated homesteads into a thriving society that valued education, cooperation, and the kind of independence that came from mutual support rather than rugged individualism. "Do you ever miss it?" Ezra asked one evening as they sat together reviewing the latest correspondence from territorial education officials who wanted to document their teaching methods. "The quiet life we had before all this started." Martha looked around their home, which had expanded far beyond the simple cabin her aunt had left her. The house now included Ezra's study, her own office for school, and Ranchers Association business, Rose's bright nursery, and a large kitchen that regularly hosted neighbors and visitors who came to discuss everything from cattle breeding to curriculum development. "No," she said honestly. "I don't miss the quiet because this isn't noise, it's the sound of life being lived fully. I don't miss the simplicity because what we've built here is better than simple. It's meaningful." Rose chose that moment to appear in the doorway, her nightgown trailing behind her and her dark hair mussed from sleep. "Mama," she said seriously, "I had a dream about when I grow up." "What did you dream, sweetheart?" Martha asked, lifting her daughter onto her lap. "I dreamed I was a teacher like you, but I was also a rancher like Papa, and I had a big school with children from all over the mountains, and everyone said I was the smartest lady in all the territory." Martha exchanged a smile with Ezra over their daughter's head, recognizing in Rose's ambitious dreams the same determination that had driven her own transformation from a rejected woman in Cedar Ridge to a respected leader in the mountain valley. "That sounds like a wonderful dream," Martha said, smoothing Rose's hair, "and you know what, I believe you can make it come true if you work hard and never give up on yourself." "Did you always know you could do all the things you do?" Rose asked, with the directness that made conversations with 4-year-olds both charming and challenging. "No, sweetheart. When I was your age, I thought I could only do the things that other people said were appropriate for girls like me. It took me a long time to learn that I could decide for myself what I was capable of. But you figured it out. I figured it out. And more importantly, I'm making sure you grow up knowing from the beginning that you can choose your own path and follow your own dreams." Rose nodded solemnly as if this were important information she needed to remember. Then, with the quick attention shifts of childhood, she wiggled off Martha's lap and ran back toward her room, calling over her shoulder, "I'm going to dream about being a cattle queen now." "A cattle queen," Ezra repeated thoughtfully after Rose had disappeared. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Martha agreed, "though I suspect by the time she's old enough to run cattle, she'll have invented some entirely new way of doing it that none of us have thought of yet." As they prepared for bed that night, Martha found herself reflecting on the strange trajectory that had brought her to this moment. 7 years ago, she had been a desperate woman fleeing a life that had never fit, armed with nothing but stubborn determination and an inheritance she didn't understand. Now she was a wife, a mother, a teacher, a community leader, and the architect of changes that would shape the mountain valley for generations to come. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was the simplest one. She had learned to love herself with the same fierce protectiveness she felt for her daughter, the same unwavering loyalty she felt for her husband, the same passionate commitment she felt for her community. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space in the world had become someone who created space for others to flourish. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out over the ranch that had become the foundation of everything she had built, Martha felt a contentment that had nothing to do with reaching a destination, and everything to do with understanding that life was not about arriving somewhere, but about growing into who you were meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to expand the vision of what was possible in this mountain valley that had become the center of her universe. Rose would wake up with new questions about the world and new dreams about her place in it. The school would welcome new students eager to learn. The Ranchers Association would tackle new projects designed to improve life for everyone in the valley. And Martha would meet each of these challenges with the same determination that had carried her through blizzards and barn fires, hostile neighbors, and her own deepest fears. Because she had learned something precious during her journey, from rejected bride to mountain matriarch, the most important victories were not the dramatic ones that made good stories, but the quiet daily choices to keep building, keep growing, keep believing that tomorrow could be better than today. as she settled into bed beside the man who had become her partner in everything that mattered. Martha smiled at the thought of all the stories yet to be written in this valley she had helped transform. Stories of children who would grow up knowing their worth was not determined by other people's expectations. Stories of women who would follow their own paths without apology. Stories of communities built on cooperation rather than competition on inclusion, rather than exclusion on the radical idea that everyone deserved the chance to become their best selves. It was a legacy worth fighting for, worth building, worth passing on to the next generation. And Martha Stone, once Martha Whitfield, the woman nobody wanted, had become exactly the person she was meant to be, someone who created space in the world for others to flourish, someone who proved that the most powerful changes often came from the most unexpected sources. Someone who understood that true success was not about fitting in, but about building something better where you stood. The mountain valley slept peacefully around them, secure in the knowledge that its future was being shaped by hands that understood both strength and gentleness, vision and practicality, the importance of dreams and the necessity of hard work to make those dreams reality.